Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am going to ask a question sort of as an icebreaker. I'll put it in the chat as well. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Cambridge and the Revolution? I'm curious to know what folks' impressions are. All right. Army camped on the Common, Siege of Boston. Some great answers here. Keep them coming, folks. Okay. Give everybody another minute or so. Fort Washington, we're going to talk about that tonight too. So excited to see all these. Yep. Washington Elm, for sure. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself and introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening, and we can keep answering as things come to you. I can't wait to see everybody's answers. My name is Beth Folsom, and I am the program manager at History Cambridge. And before we begin our program, I want to acknowledge that our headquarters, the Hooper Lee Nichols House, sits on the traditional land of the Massachusetts people. So welcome to our program. I'd like to start by asking you, I've already asked you a question about what your impressions of Cambridge and the Revolution are. I'd also love to hear who's joining us and where you're coming to us from in the chat. If you want to drop that in the chat, that would be great. And a reminder that you can use the chat box to ask questions or make comments throughout the program, and we will be having a dedicated Q&A session after our speaker. I'd like to extend a special thank you and welcome to the Friends of History Cambridge who have made tonight's event possible. And if you would like to consider joining our cozy little group, head on over to our website, which is historycambridge.org, and click on the support button at the top of the page. This program is also funded in part by Mass Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, and we thank them very much for their support. And you can sign up to receive our e-news so that you don't miss out on any future great programs like this. And a reminder that tonight's event is free, but donations are welcome, and a big thank you to many of you who made a donation. We really appreciate it. And tomorrow you will be receiving an email with a survey asking how you liked the program. Please take a minute to fill it out. It really helps us. We read all of your comments, and we're constantly striving to bring you better history, more inclusive history, more comprehensive history, and to do it in the most accessible way possible. So we really value your feedback. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. J.L. Bell is the proprietor of the Boston 1775 website, which offers daily helpings of, quote, history, analysis, and unabashed gossip about the American Revolution in New England. He researched and wrote a book-length study for the National Park Service of General George Washington's headquarters in Cambridge, now 105 Brattle Street, or the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. That study brought to light new information about the servants, enslaved and free, who worked at the headquarters and made it possible for Washington to oversee the Continental Army in the Siege of Boston. John is also the author of many articles and book chapters in the book, The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War. J.L. Bell, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you to everybody at History Cambridge for having me, and I look forward to our discussion later. I'm going to start. Beth asked me to talk a bit about the findings in that study and what it was like to work at General Washington's headquarters. Now, that's an unusual case study because it was not a typical time or place. It was the Siege of Boston. There was a war on, which means things were different from usual. But the good thing about studying that is that we have the documents. Most household accounts were private, so they were thrown away. Whereas in the case of the headquarters, all those bills, all those ledger books were submitted to the Continental Congress as part of reimbursement for General Washington's expenses. He promised to be the commander for no salary, just to have all his expenses paid, and there were a lot of expenses. And of course, everything related to Washington, documents and stories tend to be preserved. So although it is an unusual example of a household, it is also a it brings us a lot of sources, a lot of evidence to work with. And what do we find? Well, first, we find that the house that Washington used was the result of enslaved labor. We don't know who built it in 1759 or who designed it, but we know that the owner, John Vassall, had inherited slave labor plantations in Jamaica. That was the source of his wealth. That was why he, as a very young man, only in his early 20s, was able to build what was the largest, richest estate in Cambridge. He paid more property tax in town than anyone else. He visited Jamaica only very briefly before coming back to Cambridge and settling down, marrying a woman named Elizabeth Oliver, who herself was also the heir to family fortune based on slave labor plantations, in her case on Antigua. And at the same time, John's sister married Elizabeth's brother, and that couple moved to Cambridge, and they built the estate now known as Elmwood. And in fact, in the mid-1760s, all the houses of what we now call Tory Row belonged to John's aunts and their husbands. Many of those houses, if not all, had enslaved workers looking after the property. Not just domestic servants, because although those families did leave upper-class genteel lifestyles, which would have, in their minds, required having butlers, maids, cooks, and so on. But those estates were also working farms, and they were surrounded by fields and gardens and orchards and pastures. And of course, those needed people to work as well. And for most of the people along what we call Tory Row, those people might well have been enslaved. And that neighborhood came to a swift end in September 1774, as the people of Massachusetts rose up against Parliament's attempts to change the colony's charter, and they frightened John and Elizabeth Vassall and most of their neighbors into Boston, which was then in the British Army hands, guarded by the British Army, and therefore safe for people loyal to the British government. Some of those homeowners left behind some of their enslaved workers to look after their property. They just saw those people as more of their property. Their duty was to make sure that the farms continued to be looked after, that the houses didn't burn down. Obviously, those people were going to be able to support themselves through the food that was on the site, and so on. The families probably expected to come back after the army put down this rebellion, but most of them didn't. And the next spring, war broke out. A New England army besieged Boston, and the Continental Congress eventually adopted that cause, and in June sent a commander-in-chief. And in July, George Washington arrived at Cambridge. Now, with George Washington, he brought with him some enslaved workers. We don't know how many. We can be sure about one of them, a man named William Lee, Washington's body servant. Washington had bought Lee and his brother Frank at an estate sale in 1767, and they were then teenagers and described as mulatto, and it was fashionable to have lighter-skinned people of African descent as household servants in Virginia. Washington brought Lee with him throughout the entire Revolutionary War. Younger officers remembered him as Billy Lee. That's often how he's referred to in 1800s documents. But in writing, Washington always called him William. Washington probably also had an enslaved coachman or driver with him, maybe some other men, but we're not sure of their names. In December, Martha Washington arrived in Cambridge along with her son and her daughter-in-law, and they probably also brought personal servants with them, maids and valets. But because those were personal servants, they didn't go onto the government's books. They were personal property. They were private property of the Washingtons. The Washingtons were responsible for paying them for their food. Therefore, we don't know who they are. We don't know how many there were. But that was simply the lifestyle that the Washingtons were used to. In mid-July 1775, the Massachusetts government asked General Washington where he wanted to live, and he chose the empty house left behind by John Vassall. One advantage is that put him at a distance from the enlisted men living in the Harvard College buildings, closer to where he was. And the site probably also reminded him of Mount Vernon. It was a mansion overlooking the river with outbuildings, with fields, and with an enslaved workforce. We don't, however, have any record from 1775 of Washington interacting with the servants that John and Elizabeth Vassall left behind. They're never mentioned in the accounts of headquarters, and there could be two explanations for that. One is that they might have been busy maintaining the farm, maintaining other houses under the supervision of the Massachusetts government, which had sort of taken over that land temporarily. Later it took it over permanently, but at that point temporarily. It may have been that their labor as people who were attached to the house simply came with the house. It was not paid for. It was nothing that needed to go in the expense books because Cuba Vassall was sweeping the floor as usual. We just don't know. We do know, however, from other sources who that family was. A couple named Tony and Cuba Vassall. He was from the Caribbean. She was from Jamaica. They had originally been owned by John's uncle and aunt who lived across the street and down a way. And we know about that because they continued to live in Cambridge as Tony and Cuba Vassall. They had children, some of whom lived in Cambridge, some in Boston. They, in fact, after the war, when changes in Massachusetts law and their own situation caused them to become free, they became sort of the founders of a small African-American community near the Vassall estate. We also have a story told later about one of the Vassall children meeting General Washington. This story was told many decades later. It was written down decades after that. It's garbled in its telling, but it's such a good story that I can't resist telling it. At the front gate, it's told the general met a black boy, son of Tony and Cuba Vassall, apparently Darby Vassall, who was then about 6 years old. And the story goes that General Washington, to set his mind at ease for the future, told him to go into the house and they would tell him what to do and give him something to eat. I.e., Washington was looking at this little boy and saying, okay, laborer will work for me for food. And reportedly little Darby inquired what would be the wages. And it was such a shock to General Washington for a black child to ask him for money that he reportedly chided the boy for being so unreasonable at such a time as to expect to be paid. And Darby Vassall grew up to complain that George Washington was no gentleman. He wanted a boy to work without wages. And that complaint is one reason I think that this story has a whiff of authenticity, because it's so rare in 19th century America to complain about General Washington, the sainted George Washington, in any way. And here, Darby Vassall was calling him out as somebody who was exploiting child labor, black labor, labor asking for wages. That sort of encapsulates part of what General Washington experienced when he arrived from New England. He had come as an ordinary Virginia planter. He had been used to being cared for by enslaved people of African descent from the day he was born. He had been the legal owner of people since he was 11 years old. He was, in fact, he had become the manager of one of Virginia's largest slave labor plantations when he married Martha Custis. And so the situation in Massachusetts was in some ways the same. Slavery is still legal, but in some ways was quite different, and he had to learn that. Now, if Tony and Cuba Vassall and their family weren't doing the household work at Washington's headquarters, who were? The first historian to study the staff at Washington's Cambridge headquarters was John C. Fitzpatrick, who edited the president's papers for the Library of Congress in the 1930s. And he acknowledged it was hard, but he started with a steward or household manager whom he called Ebenezer Austin, and then he listed many other names, including Edward Hunt, a cook, and a French cook named Adam Fouts. And when I went back over those names, I found that some were actually local craftsmen. They weren't at the house, they were selling stuff to the house. Edward Hunt was at the house, but only for 2 months. Then he left. Adam Fouts, he was in Pennsylvania during the siege of Boston. He didn't join Washington's staff until years later. And by that time, the headquarters had been staff had been reorganized. It had become part of the Continental military. It was so Fouts was officially a soldier who was ordered to go work for Washington because he was a cook. In 1775 Massachusetts, the colonial government, the rebel government, was supplying the building and the staff. Washington was paying the servants privately from local people. And most of that household staff was female. In fact, that was the way most big Massachusetts households ran in the 18th century. Women worked in the house. Women did the cooking, the cleaning, the mending. What was unusual was that a man was in charge at headquarters, that steward. And his name was Timothy Austin, not Ebenezer Austin. He was 57 years old. He was a leather dresser from Charlestown. He was a deacon of the Charlestown's first meeting. He had served as the town treasurer, which meant that he could handle accounts. He knew the politicians. His second wife, Lydia, was a daughter of Cornelius Waldo, who was the promoter of the Waldoboro settlement in Maine. So a pretty fancy gentleman, pretty rich family. And by his first wife, Timothy Austin had a daughter named Mary, who was 30 years old. And I think that when the estate accounts say that the general paid Timothy Austin, his wife and daughter, for work over 9 months, it was Timothy, Lydia, and Mary. And so we have, you know, 2 women and 1 man, but the man is getting paid, or he's collecting the pay. Why would the Austins, who are a solidly prosperous family in Charlestown, come to work at the general's headquarters? Well, because Charleston had burned down during the Battle of Bunker Hill, and those people needed someplace to live and some means of support. And since the Massachusetts government was looking for somebody to look after the Washington household, this seemed like a good match. There's a similar story behind another name on the list of household servants, listed as Eliza or Elizabeth Chapman. In April 1776, Timothy Austin paid Chapman 6-month wages at the house, a little over £2. I was able to identify this woman. She was a teenager. She and her mother and siblings had lived in Charlestown before the war. And then as the war began, they moved away from the probable scene of fighting. And in May, her brother found them living in Malden with some little furniture. And then came the Bunker Hill battle, and the Chapman's house probably burned down, and they couldn't go back. So they were war refugees. And Eliza Chapman came to work at the general's headquarters, probably as a housemaid. So again, a woman in need of support, shelter, and work. Now, almost all of the Massachusetts household staff stayed behind when Washington left in April 1776. There was one exception, is very interesting, a woman named Margaret Thomas. On February 22nd, 1776, we know that Timothy Austin paid her, quote, for making 3 shirts for William. And William, we remember, was William Lee, the general's enslaved body servant. Margaret was a free Black woman who went to work for headquarters, traveled around with headquarters throughout the war. So she, for instance, there's a bill from her doing laundry for Washington and his officers from October 1776 to February 1778. So she was at Valley Forge working for the general. Most interestingly, she and William Lee became a couple. Then they were separated after the war. Washington brought Lee back to Mount Vernon while Margaret Thomas lived in Philadelphia. But in July 1784, a year after the war ended, William Lee came to Washington and said that he had married Margaret Thomas during the war, and he wanted her to come to Mount Vernon to live with him, especially since she was ill and needed support. Now, Washington didn't like that. He doesn't seem to have been too fond of Margaret Thomas personally. He also felt it would be awkward to have a free Black woman living among his enslaved workforce, but he felt he owed it to William Lee, because of their experiences during the war, to do what his body servant was asking. So even though he didn't want to do it, he did this for the sake of a man whom he was still keeping enslaved. Washington wrote to his agent in Philadelphia asking him to find Margaret Thomas, and if he could, to send her to Mount Vernon. Now, unfortunately, the story ends there. There's no record of Margaret Thomas making that trip. There's no record of the agent finding her. But it does show that there was more life going on, as I say, downstairs, behind the scenes of Washington's headquarters, and that the general himself had to keep adjusting to that. The biggest adjustment he had to make during those months in Cambridge had to do with the actual soldiers, the people who did the work of fighting. The roles of the Massachusetts militia show that on April 19th, 1775, the first year of the Revolutionary War, Black men were taking part in the fighting. No one in New England could have missed the name of Prince Easterbrooks, parens, a Negro man, on the casualty list that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress circulated after the battle. And Prince Estabrook, as he's usually called, was still legally enslaved. He wasn't freed until the end of the war. He was also listed on that casualty list without a Mr. before his name, like the white men. So it was clear that the militia force was integrated. In May 1775, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety announced that only such as are free men could serve in the colony's army. And that reflected their ideology that they were not dividing between blacks and whites, they were dividing between free men and slaves, and free men only should be fighting for the society's liberty. Washington, however, wasn't comfortable with that approach. He saw the presence of Black soldiers in the army that he found when he came to Cambridge as a sign that the New England Army recruiters had been scraping the bottom of the barrel, not that they were, had already been in the militia. And in July, the colony responded by saying, okay, to the officers, don't enlist any more Black soldiers. But there were still Black soldiers in the army. They were still being paid the same as the white soldiers. They were still being assigned the same, although there were no Black officers. By the fall of 1775, Washington realized that he would have to re-enlist troops or recruit troops for the new year. The enlistments ran out at the end of 1775 for almost all the soldiers. Still, he didn't want any Black soldiers, so he got the Council of War, his other generals, and then the Continental Congress into barring Blacks. But then it actually got to the end of the year, and he didn't have a big army. He was very worried that without thousands of troops on his side, the British would storm out of Boston and overwhelm his thin lines. And so at the end of the year, General George Washington changed his mind. On December 30th, he created a new policy in his general orders and allowed officers to re-enlist Black soldiers. And he promised to go back to Congress and get them to reverse the policy that he had asked them to put in place in the first place. And in practice, that meant that the Army continued to recruit Black soldiers, and including new ones. And in fact, by the end of the war, a significant proportion of the Continental Army were men of Black and Native descent, and they were, except for the fact that they were not promoted to officer level, they were treated pretty much the same as the white men. They were paid the same, they received the same food and clothing, and they weren't segregated in separate units, with one temporary exception from Rhode Island. So this was actually, the Continental Army was the last integrated American army until the fighting in Korea. And that was because it had started out as a New England army, and Washington had to adjust from what he was seeing from his Cambridge headquarters. So that's sort of the basis for how things looked to General Washington and to the other people at headquarters. There was a lot more going on around the siege lines, which I'm happy to talk about now. And so, Beth, if you've got any questions, let's talk further about the work of getting the British out of Boston and organizing the Continental Army.
Absolutely. So I have some findings to share from a tour, a self-guided tour that we are premiering, which will be going up on our website tomorrow, about some of these sites of unpaid and underpaid labor in and around the Cambridge area. But I would love to hear, since we're on this topic, I would love to hear more about the military service of Black men in particular. My first question would be if you could speak a little bit to some of the differentiation in training and in specific jobs that these soldiers were given, were assigned, and how that changed over time.
Well, the militia laws in Massachusetts required all white men between 16 and 60 to drill regularly, to train with their arms 4 times a year usually, and to be ready as an emergency force. And these laws exempted some people at some men at the very top of society, i.e. Harvard graduates, ministers, a lot of town officials or government officials, people who had already been officers in the militia. They were exempted from training. And then it also exempted or barred people at the bottom of the society, Blacks, Native Americans. However, those laws were tended to be instituted in the 17th, early 18th century. We can see that during the actual alarm in the Lexington Alarm of April 19th, 1775, there were Blacks and Native Americans coming out and serving. Furthermore, we know from earlier colonial wars and from the Revolutionary War that men of Black and Native descent were soldiers in the regular companies who were not militia short term, but were signed up usually for the whole year. And there were even examples like David Lamson in West Cambridge, who was of Native and African descent, who was seen because of his experience at war as a leader of what was called the Company of Invalids, the men who were older or not thought to be physically able to do all the work of drilling and fighting. And so while the main militia company from that part of Cambridge had marched off to confront the Redcoats, they were sort of left behind, whereupon some British supply wagons came through town, and David Lamson set up an ambush, and they captured these wagons. We know that as the army changed, some of those militiamen, many of them joined the what was the Massachusetts or Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island Army, thus became part of the Continental Army in June 1775. We can see on cases of like there's a petition I saw of soldiers complaining that they had signed up to work under this particular officer, and now they had been shuttled off into this other officer and they didn't like him. And there are a whole bunch of signatures from the privates complaining about this. This is not something that Washington would have respected. He didn't like that sort of break with hierarchy. And even more surprising, perhaps, is that some of the soldiers who signed or made their marks on that petition were Black soldiers. And there's no indication on that document that they were not white. There's no indication that they were not being treated the same. Now, of course, they were complaining about bad treatment. As the war went on, some Black soldiers were made into what were called waiters, sort of personal servants to officers. Often this was also a job for especially young soldiers. The famous Deborah Sampson, who enlisted as Robert Shurtleff, she was in this job for a while. There are other cases of soldiers in general being set to digging fortifications, building barracks, things like that. And I know that there's a story from Private Jacob Francis, who had been enslaved as a teenager and then had become free in Salem and joined the army. He tells a story of helping to build some sort of fortification, and General Israel Putnam coming by and telling, they say, throw that log up there, and the man he spoke to turning and saying, well, I'm a corporal, and so I don't do that. And Putnam getting off his horse, picking up the log and throwing it on himself, which is very Putnam. This story was eventually retold with Washington in Putnam's place, but it is one of the few first-person accounts of manual labor being done by the soldiers. It comes from a black soldier, but it's clear that he is describing an integrated company that's doing that work. We don't really have, until later in the war, the idea of a pioneer company, which were often natives or blacks. We do have some differentiation between the Stockbridge Indians, who were living and supposedly fighting in the Indian style, and the rest of the Massachusetts Army. But in general, it was an integrated army at the enlisted level, and a nearly all-white army at the officer level.
Thank you. I see that Jessica has her hand raised, and I'd like to invite her, if she wants to ask a question, to go ahead and unmute herself. Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, I get it. I just took me a moment because my laptop. But thank you, Beth and Bell. A very interesting talk. And I wanted to piggyback on Beth's last question about the formation of the Continental Army. You, at the end of your talk, mentioned except Rhode Island. And I was just wondering if you can speak to that further, because I actually have people who fought there, who enlisted in Charlestown, who were the Narragansetts. So particularly interested what your further research has shown. Thank you.
Okay, well, Rhode Island, that's a good question. Rhode Island sent troops fairly quickly to join the basically mostly Massachusetts Army around Boston. And they came under General Nathaniel Greene. They were a small contingent, but very well organized. They had uniforms. They were really impressive to Washington. Later in the war, one of Greene's brothers led the recruitment and organization of a couple of regiments known as the 1st Rhode Island and the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, which were largely drawn from the Narragansetts and other Black and Native communities in Rhode Island. And as a result, they sort of stood out in the Army for a couple of years. By the end of that time, Washington himself decided, and the officers below agreed, which is what it's like to be the commander-in-chief, but Washington wanted to break up those units and spread out the men so that there would not be a quote-unquote Black Corps anymore, CORPS. So those men were seen as valuable. They were seen as good soldiers, but he didn't want them in a segregated unit. So that for a couple of years of the war, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was a largely African or Native American group. And then later in the war, it was an integrated group like the other parts of the Army. And so it's important when we read about the 1st Rhode Island or the Rhode Island troops to know what year the reference is.
I do have that information, and I was just wondering if part of this question of splitting the Corps with the people of color would have to do when it would come time for pensions to be paid out. I'm just posing that question.
That is a good question. Honestly, they were not planning pensions during the war, not for the enlisted men.
Not in the beginning, probably.
That's right. You were paid, and you were supposed to be doing it for the honor and for the benefit of society, and for to become to secure your rights. There were At the end of the war, people often received land grants instead of hard money, because there was no hard money and the currency was terribly inflated. Later, if you were wounded, you might receive a pension, but what we think of as the Revolutionary War pensions were instituted in the early 1800s by Congress, at first for soldiers who needed support, soldiers who were on hard times, veterans, and then frankly, as men died out and it was less expensive, you had fewer people to pay for, the pensions became more generous, and eventually everybody who had fought in the war could get pensions. And black soldiers were being paid pensions along with white soldiers, and those records are very valuable for telling us who was fighting. The story I told earlier about Jacob Francis and Israel Putnam came from his pension account. I can think of other men I looked up. Probably there were some sort of structural barriers to getting pensions for Black veterans, because you needed to have the social capital to go to officials and get your story down in the proper form and written down and sent off to Washington with the correct paperwork and things like that. So Black veterans may not have gotten pensions at the same rate as white veterans, but they were eligible in the same way. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you very much. Yes, I keep muting and yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd love to just take a few minutes and share some of the other findings that we found in our research as we've been creating this tour about some of the other forms of labor, unpaid and underpaid, that took place in other sites around Cambridge. And then I would love to see what folks are curious about and what questions you have. So I originally wanted to title this program, Washington Slept Here, but Who Changed His Sheets? And that kind of tells you, I think, a lot of what I was excited to focus on, which is women's stories of women's labor and how women in particular took their domestic labor, their unpaid family and emotional labor of households and translated it into the revolutionary cause. And so one of the big groups of women that we see doing this underpaid labor is nurses, which were almost uniformly white women working in Army hospitals. And so we know that at least several estates on or around Brattle Street were either confiscated by or lent to the Patriot cause, including the Vassal Craigie Longfellow House and the Ruggles Fairweather House, which became a hospital. And nurses' duties at that time were largely custodial. They were feeding and bathing patients. They were cleaning wards. Sometimes they were doing laundry and or cooking. Medical knowledge and treatments at this time were still quite what we would consider quite primitive. There were not nearly the same amount of medical advances during the Revolutionary Wars there were, say, during the Civil War. And so most nurses had little to no formal training, and neither did many doctors at that time as well. So why did some women become nurses during the Revolution? Some were motivated by what we kind of ascribe to them as patriotic sentiment or kind of socialization to care for others and do that work of caregiving. But there were certainly other motivations that took priority, and one was physical safety, as John spoke about as well, with the housekeeping family that came to vassal house. There were many women who were left without husbands, fathers, brothers, or sons, men, the male heads of their family, who were fighting, and women were often alone and vulnerable in their houses with children and or elderly relatives, and living and working in an army hospital provided protection for women and their children. And economic security. So many women had to provide for themselves and their dependents, even if their male relatives were supposed to be paid as soldiers. We know that that was hard to come by. It was behind schedule at best, and lacking at worst. So nurses were often given room and board for themselves and their children, as well as their meager salary. So pay was still dismally low. It started out at the beginning of the war at $2 a month for female nurses, compared to $40 a month for male doctors. The Army did up this to $8 a month during the course of the war to attract and retain more nurses, but still only 20% of what the male doctors were making. And some challenges that the nurses faced during this time: it was not considered socially acceptable for a woman to care for a man who was not part of her immediate family or household. So there was sort of that social barrier to overcome. Nurses were, for the most part, considered civilians and therefore not part of the military hierarchy. And so the downside of that was that they weren't able to move through the ranks and achieve some measure of economic or social mobility in the way that poor or middling white men were able to do through military service. But the upside was that they were not always bound by the same rules because they were civilians and not soldiers. And the biggest risk was the risk of disease: smallpox, typhoid, contaminated food and water. So all of the same risks that came to the soldiers came to the nurses as well, who were caring for them. And John talked quite a bit about women, Black and white women, as housekeepers, maids, kitchen staff at the Longfellow House. Most Black women who performed these jobs were enslaved and thus unpaid, but not all. But although there were free Black women who were employed in these jobs, the fact that they were paid so little and that they were doing much the same kind of labor that their enslaved counterparts were doing illustrates the low value that white society placed on those forms of labor. And many of the women, both Black and white, doing these jobs had family connections to other workers in the same household, as John spoke to us about the family at the Longfellow House. And like nursing, household labor was often physically taxing with long hours and difficult working conditions. But again, they were motivated, these women were motivated by largely the same issues of physical security and economic security during wartime. Another large group of women laborers were the laundresses and cooks in the Army camps. So several people put in the chat that they thought of Cambridge Common, and the big image that comes to many people's minds is this what ended up being a fictitious image of Washington taking command of the Army under the Washington Elm. But we also have a vision of it becoming sort of a large ad hoc army camp. And of course, who is going to be feeding these soldiers, who is going to be cleaning up after them and doing their laundry and making sure that they were presentable and ready for battle. Many were following their husbands, fathers, or brothers into the Army, extending their unpaid caregiving duties to the barracks or the encampments. And it was largely a result of not wanting to or not being able to stay in their living quarters while their men were away, although many also wanted to be close to their loved ones and keep their families intact. This was mostly unpaid labor, although some did get a small stipend, but they got rations for themselves and their children. And the responsibility for minimizing disease through ensuring food and water were uncontaminated, which was the part of the cook's responsibilities, and that the uniforms and other linens were properly washed and sterilized, which the laundresses did. And laundresses in particular understood, especially as the war went on, understood their crucial role in stopping the spread of disease in the camps through their work as laundresses. And they used this to their advantage. We have reports of laundresses sort of banding together and saying, hey, you know, your army's going to collapse through disease if it's not for us and our sanitation, our boiling, and our laundry methods that are keeping disease at bay. So they were able to negotiate higher wages and improve conditions for themselves through that. One other group we discovered and learned about were women as tavern keepers. These were almost exclusively white women that would have been performing these jobs. Many worked alongside their male relatives, but some were sole proprietors and or took over temporarily while their husbands were serving in the military. And in these taverns and working in these environments, they helped to create space for discussion among white men about revolutionary issues and political strategy. And in Cambridge, places like Cooper's Tavern and the Blue Anchor Tavern served as gathering places for common people to share news and exchange ideas. And the last group that we learned about was agricultural labor, which a lot of people probably don't think of when they think about Cambridge, certainly not now, but although Cambridge had an increasing number of shops and professional offices by the time of the Revolution, as well as, of course, Harvard, large swaths of the town were still devoted to agriculture, and much of the food used to feed the army was grown locally, whether in Cambridge or in the environs. Black and white women, as well as Black men, made up a large portion of these agricultural laborers, mostly on their own homesteads or those they worked as hired hands or as enslaved workers. And these laborers were crucial to the revolutionary effort as they provided food for the troops, as well as for those working in army camps, hospitals, etc. And then the last group was actually a group of laborers who did not reside anywhere near Cambridge, but were integral to the revolutionary efforts. And that was those enslaved workers on Caribbean plantations. So many of the elites, especially in West Cambridge, made their money from enslaved labor on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, as John talked about. And most notably, most of these were in either Jamaica or Antigua. And not only did this labor finance their Tory Row mansions of the white elites and their estates in other Massachusetts towns, but large bequests from the profits of slavery went to establish and maintain educational, religious, and political establishments before, during, and after the Revolution. And just one example of this, last year, Harvard made the decision to introduce a new shield to replace that of Isaac Royal Jr., who was the Brattle Street resident whose large monetary donation helped to establish the university's law school. And Royal's inherited family fortune was built on the backs of enslaved laborers in the Caribbean, and he himself was a plantation owner who exploited enslaved workers for tremendous profit. And other institutions, including Cambridge's largest churches, were the beneficiaries of enslaved Caribbean labor, even as these wealthy white donors were publicly advocating for liberty with regard to their relationship with British rule. So we can say that a large portion of the unpaid labor that supported Cambridge's revolutionary efforts was being performed by workers thousands of miles away. So I think it's important for us to include that group of non-paid laborers in our analysis of what made the revolution possible for Cambridge elites. So I would love to open up the floor. We've had a lot of fascinating facts thrown out at us, and I would love to open it for discussion. If you, I believe if you use the hand raise feature, I can, you'll be brought to the front of my screen and I'll be able to see you, but feel free as well to drop any questions or comments that you have in the chat.
While we wait, I'll just mention our friends at Ryle House and slave quarters will want to say that Isaac Ryle lived in Medford, but his sister Penelope lived on Brattle Street.
On Brattle Street, yes, yes. So while we wait for questions, John, I would love to hear a little bit about, you alluded to the reason that it's easier for us as historians and people interested in history to trace the workers and the labor that was performed at Washington's headquarters, because of course it was Washington and it was a government account. But I'm curious to know if you have any other insights or recommendations for looking at or getting to the information about laborers in other maybe private archives, or what is your best bet for reading between the lines so that we can glean as much information as we can about these folks who folks didn't necessarily think was important to keep records on? How can we access that information?
Well, often where people intersect with the government and the legal system, that creates paperwork. So for instance, John and Elizabeth Vassal's, John's brother-in-law, Elizabeth's brother, Thomas Oliver, he left Elmwood and he left enslaved servants behind as well. And the state, or colony, then state, had to look after those people. And there are government records showing that a woman was looking after a sick boy, maybe about 12 years old, from that estate. And the only reason we know about that is because they were intersecting with the government. We know that Tony and Cuba Vassal, after they became free, they petitioned to the state of Massachusetts for pensions, one after the other, on the grounds that since the state had confiscated the Vassal estate, the state had made itself responsible for them in their old age as well. And so even though Tony was able to buy his own land, have a little farrier shop or forge, he was also connecting with the state. So we don't have, in his case, personal papers. We don't have his will, but we do have the petitions to the government because the government saves paper. So any way you can find an intersection with government, that usually leaves a trace on the records. A court case, a will, or in the case of this woman who wanted to be paid for looking after this sick child. Well, we look at that now and we think, tell us more about this sick child. Tell us about his experiences. Tell us about who he was. Tell us his name. I don't even know if that appears. But what we've got, we have something about him at least, because it connected with the government.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really great point about the lens through which people of color, women, poor folks, immigrants, etc., are portrayed, because especially when you're dealing with government records, it is the white dominant culture that's holding the power in that situation, and you're seeing everything through the lens of that power structure. So for instance, I know it's problematic to look at court records because you're seeing run-ins with the white dominated legal establishment, and what view is that giving you of people from marginalized communities? So it's great when people have run-ins with government, and it's also somewhat problematic at the same time. But as historians, we have to kind of take what we're given and continue to dig deeper, but look at what sources are available to us. I see Frank has his hand raised. Frank, I would love for you to unmute and ask your question, and then we have a question from Janie Ward in the chat.
So I have two questions, which regarding what I've heard since I've been on this call, which would correct things I've read. The first one was that many of the revolutionary troops when money went short, were paid with chits, and that those chits were supposed to be backed by the US government. But in a biography of Hamilton that I read, he took over those chits and insisted that the only ones that he would pay for and honor were the ones that were backed by gold. Is there any truth to that?
That's a great many governments during the Revolutionary War issued paper money which were basically, as you say, chits, basically IOUs from the government, and they were supposed to be more stable than the private IOUs, because of course it was the government and we would be able to tax. And every one of those, the state and the continental currency, went into tremendous inflation. And so by the end of the war, that money and the war bonds and other forms of credit extended to the government did not seem like a good investment at all. And soldiers, veterans who needed immediate cash, often paid those out at a great discount to speculators, investors who thought that who were usually better off financially and able to pay over cash. Hamilton was actually, as I understand it, his idea was the federal government should take over all those state debts. There's even a song about this. That's the basis of the Hamilton musical's "Room Where It Happened" song. And by taking over the state debts, the plan was to stabilize the currency, but also to make people who owned that debt, the creditors, get behind the federal government, because if they saw that the only way they're going to be paid back in full with interest is for the federal government to be strong, then they would become supporters. And he also felt that this government would benefit from a sort of regular issuing and paying off of debts. And yes, those debts, he was saying that the currency should be eventually paid back in gold and silver, in specie, hard money, as they said. But he also, he actually wanted all the currency to be consolidated. So he wasn't making a distinction between state and continental currency. He was trying to consolidate.
Well, I think that the intent of this particular piece in the story was that he was dishonest in his intent, and he made a lot of money as a result of this.
Some people did make a lot of money, no question. The speculators, if you were buying up these what seemed like worthless currency and holding it long enough, if you had the wherewithal to do that, then you actually got money back, and it was a good investment. One person who actually did quite well by this was Abigail Adams. And Woody Holton's biography of her starts with her as a financial dealer. Other people like Robert Morris, he was actually carrying the continental government on his own wallet for a while late in the war, because he had better credit than the entire government. But then a few years later, he over-speculated and he ended up in debtor's prison. So there were lots of difficult investments in the 1780s. It was the economy went into a tailspin after the war, and a lot of soldiers and a lot of investors felt that they had been cheated. But another author on this topic is William Hoagland, in the book Founding Finance, and he takes a more jaundiced view of the whole situation than some of the people who, like Charles Rapelye, who praise Robert Morris for his financial system. So it's controversial even now. I think a lot of the people who criticize, who say, the speculators should not have been allowed to buy this debt, that the people who paid, who sold off their IOUs from the government for much less than face value needed some sort of compensation. Well, that seems fair to us, but that's not the way our financial system works either. If we're buying government bonds and then selling them off for less than face value, that's on us. Thank you.
So my other question is regarding the money that, or the wealth that funded the revolution in part, it came from the Caribbean. But most of the people that owned those plantations were Tories. weren't they?
We would actually, I would say that much of the money that funded the North American colonies of Britain came from the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. That was where a lot of money was made. Now, the rice plantations in South Carolina, and even to a large extent, the wheat fields of Connecticut were able to support themselves, but the real wealth was coming out of the sugar plantations. You're right, those people, by and large, were Tories. The Vassals were Tories, the Olivers were Tories. They were not taking their money. I mean, they
They were not
they left. They went to Britain. They enjoyed their great fortunes from the backs of others for many years. And as it turned out, John Vassall actually went to the British government and asked for compensation for his losses in Cambridge. And the government more or less said, "You are so rich that this is just a tiny part of your fortune. Why are you even coming to us?" So I would not say that the wealth of the Caribbean funded the revolution, but a lot of the wealth that was in the colonies had been built on trade with the Caribbean. And when somebody like the Darby family of Salem decided to start supporting the revolution financially as well as with their people, they were taking what had been proceeds from the Caribbean trade and putting it towards the revolution.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd love to get a question from Janie Ward. She, in talking about the agricultural land in Cambridge, she says many Blacks worked as hired hands on these farms, and did any own their own property? And that is a great question. I know certainly that that they did own property in Cambridge. Many of those Blacks were folks who had emancipated themselves in the aftermath of their Tory enslavers fleeing Cambridge and leaving them behind, and they decided to self-emancipate, and then were able to purchase property. I don't know particularly if that was agricultural or farmland, orchards, things like that. So I don't know. I have more research to do into that. I don't know if John has any idea about that in particular.
There's a good book called Black Walden, which looks at Concord as a similar community, and often the people, the formerly enslaved people who set up their own houses, were often had to stick to marginal land, land that wasn't good farmland, land that they might not even have clear title to, simply because they got their freedom, but they were not getting, for the most part, resources to buy land. There are some cases where, especially from service in the war, Black veterans were able to set up their own farms. And the pension records, which we talked about earlier, they sometimes will talk about men like Abel Benson having had his own farm after his service in the Continental Army. So this was a period of transition, legal transition, economic transition. They didn't know, people going into the war did not know what the next 10 years would bring. And we can be, for the most part, in this part of the country, pleased with how things turned out. But it wasn't the same everywhere, and people didn't know what they were getting into. At one point, Tony Vassall is on the records in Cambridge, but he is neither being charged as a Pole, i.e. as a free man who might be eligible to vote, nor being charged as property, because the Vassals had left. The government did not know what he was, who he was, in about 1780. And then in 1783, a Massachusetts court case made slavery unenforceable in Massachusetts. And at that point, it was quite clear that he was a free man. And at that point, sooner or later, whenever he bought his property, he had to pay property tax.
Thank you. We have another question from Francis, who says, was there a general policy that would free enslaved soldiers after some period of service in the Continental Army, or are the stories one hears about granting of freedom just exceptions made for some individuals?
That's a good question. It would be nice if there was a general policy, but there was not. It was, since slavery was a matter of private property under the law, it was up to the individual owner and individual soldier whether there were any arrangements that, the soldier could go off to war and send his pay home for 5 years and then he would be free, or what. And there were probably surprises involved in this, like soldiers who never came home and just went and lived their lives as free men. But there was sort of, I would say, sort of a general understanding that, it would be a good idea if, since men had fought for freedom, that they should become free. But at no point do I know of any official policy on the part of either the Army or the continental or state governments that would enforce that on the property owners, i.e. the slave owners.
And following up on that, can you speak at all to the experience of enslaved men who went to the British side to fight in the hopes that they were promised emancipation from that side?
There we have that wasn't such a factor during the siege of Boston. The first year of the war was odd in many ways, but once the British were established in New York and then in Charleston, South Carolina, two major ports, they were able to attract a lot of African American men and women, and they did have substantial numbers of Black men in uniform or supporting the troops. And at the end of the war, they evacuated thousands of these people to Canada. And there is good records of these people. And in fact, there are some who originally came from Boston, from besieged Boston. There was a family of printers in Boston named the Fleets, and they owned a family of printers also named Fleet who were enslaved. And there were two brothers, Caesar and Cato Fleet. One of them stayed in Boston, became part of the African Lodge of Freemasons, had a family. We can see him, we can spot him in the records. The other one left for New York and then to Nova Scotia with a wife and child, and set up his life there. He had decided to become a loyalist, and he had left the Fleets who owned this family and built a new life. So we can see in that one family the different courses. For most African-American laborers enslaved in the Southern colonies, they didn't have the process of being able to become free within their home colony, within their home state. Their only way out was to join the British.
So I'm wondering too, whether there was a certain amount of buy-in on the part of formerly enslaved soldiers about the meritocracy, or the working your way up through military service. And I'm thinking that's something that's sort of been a consistent theme for people from marginalized communities all the way through, I would say, through the present. Respectability and upward mobility coming through military service. And I'm wondering if this is something that we see as an aspirational hope among Black soldiers.
Okay, I was muted, sorry. I think there are traces of that social aspiration, but of course it's much harder when the society does not encourage that sort of mobility. And as I said before, I think I've found only one case of a man of African descent being granted an officer's commission during the war, and he was actually a native fighter. So completely multicultural. And he got more or less an honorary lieutenant colonel commission. So the faith in social mobility would be a lot thinner if you're not actually socially mobile. But there are definitely cases of, William Cooper Nell writes about a family with a veteran as the father, who made the argument that I fought for the liberty in the Revolutionary War, and therefore I should be treated, in this case, allowed to buy a pew in my hometown church the way anybody else can. We can see some pride in Abel Benson's pension records, where he talks about some of his military equipment that he has kept around for decades before he applied for a pension. And this is one of the pensions where he had to show that he was poor. So he was talking about how little property he had, and yet he had some things that he still held from the Revolutionary War. So I think there was definitely pride in Continental Army veterans, whether they were able within that society to leverage that into higher social mobility. That's much harder to see. The case of James Fortin in Philadelphia might be an example. He became a leader of the African-American community and of the civil rights struggle in the early 1800s. However, he did that mostly through being a damn good businessman as a sailmaker and just becoming rich enough that for a while he was able to live the life as a gentleman. And then towards the end of his life, he was seeing his rights being stripped away legally in Jacksonian America.
Thank you. So I know that we are coming towards the end of our time together, but I want to make sure that anyone that has any lingering questions or comments has a chance to throw them out so that we can talk about them. I will put in a plug in the meantime for, as Marika put in the chat, our thinking about our ties to the Caribbean in Cambridge, and also the enslaved people whom we know about and whom we have lost records of, that were enslaved and lived and worked in the area around what we now call Brattle Street during the Revolutionary period and in a broader time frame as well. So we have an art installation by the group Black Coral, the artist collective Black Coral. It is currently on view on our lawn at the Hooper Lee Nichols house at 159 Brattle Street. It is going to be on view through October. It also has solar lights, and so it lights up at night. It's beautiful to see in the day or the evening. And we are going to be having a public celebration and ceremony on July 16th. And Marika has put the link to that in the chat as well. And if you have been already to see the art, we would love to hear what you think about it. There is a form that you can add to also in the chat. So if there are no further questions, I want to thank everybody for being here. It was a great informative journey. There's so much more to learn and to value about this unpaid and underpaid labor during the Revolution. I want to thank especially our supporters for making it possible to bring you this event free of charge. And don't forget, we'll be sending a survey via email, and please do go ahead and fill that out. And I want to thank John Bell especially. We unfortunately, Dr. Robert Bellinger, who was going to be here with us, had an emergency, was not able to make it. So we especially appreciate John's flexibility and thinking on his feet. And he has such a depth of knowledge that that's not hard for him to do. So thank you all so much. And please come see us on the 16th. And in the meantime, learn learn more about our art and take the survey. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great night.